All right. So just to kind of get us caught up. So psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. So human growth and development fall under that main definition, but what we're mainly concerned with when we're talking about human development is how we change over time. And we're going to look in three kind of specific places. We're going to look at biological change, socio-emotional change, and cognitive change, which we'll get to in the next slide. And it was kind of in that introductory video that is in our Canvas page as well, okay? Now, we will be spending quite a bit of the semester on 0 to 18. And this has some historical precedents behind it. It's the most studied age group that we have. But it is also because one of our first theories that we're going to talk about, which is Sigmund Freud's theory, he ended development at 18. He said, nothing happens after that. When you turn 18, your personality set, your intelligence is set, your everything is set. And so for a large amount of time in the study of development, we just went to 18 because it was assumed there wasn't much that happened after that. But what happened is we have the Industrial Revolution, we have a medical evolution, and our lifespan doubles within about 100 years. Okay, we go from the average life being up to about 38 to 40, and now we're living, I believe, in the United States, the average age is something like 76, I believe, or 73, one of those two. We'll get to it a little bit later. We're not there yet. And that's how we determine. And so we see that with this doubling of the lifespan, that there has to be much more after the age of 18. And so in the last about 40 years or so, 40, 50 years, we've expanded our reach of understanding human development to include adulthood past 18 and into young adulthood and middle adulthood and late adulthood, which the good news for all of us, there is still some pretty cool development we can do after 18. We're not done yet. So that'll be the good news to come. But just so everyone knows, about 0 to 18 will be it has a lot of information in it. The other thing is that childhood too is we know that it's a special period of time as well, which we'll get to. Because that is when our brain is still developing, both physically and mentally. And we know that the frontal cortical area of the brain doesn't get to its full development until someone is around 18 to 21. So it is a unique lifespan. There's a lot of changes that are physically happening and psychologically and emotionally happening. And that's kind of why we see this period as a special period of time. We should note that it is unique. Childhood, this idea of uniqueness of childhood is a modern conceptualization. If we look at history before the Industrial Revolution, which allowed mothers and caregivers to pay more attention to their children and those types of things. Before the Industrial Revolution, children were had because it was a labor force. On the farm, you needed workers. You were distanced. You just didn't go hire a handyman or whatever. And so your children were part of the workforce. And it was believed that children were born as adults. We were just waiting for them to physically catch up, okay? So this notion that childhood is a special period of time, it's 100, 200 years old. And so, but we have learned a lot, and we now know a lot more about childhood than we ever have. So I mentioned that our lifespan has also doubled over the last 120 years. I mean, the average age before the 1900s was around 38 to 40, was old age, considered old age. And this has, and we'll look at these arguments when we get to this point, is that some theorists believe that we actually live 2 lifetimes. 0 to 40 is one, and then 40 to death is another. And their evidence for this is we know that a lot of people between about the age of 37 to 45 are having major life transitions. If you even look here at Tonoph Community College, our average age of student has been ticking up, right? Last year, the average age of a student here was 33. This year, it's 34. And so we know that people go through these transition phases sometime between this period. This is a period when we have the highest divorce rates. It's the period when we have most of work transition. And so we'll see when we get to this point that there might be an argument that we do actually live 2 lifetimes compared to our past. But we also will spend some time talking about this age group because it's important, this middle adulthood that we note about. If you read the popular literature and read the news or whatever, social media, there's a lot of criticism about younger populations, talking, teens, 20s, late 20s, and they're going, this generation is they're messing up. You can hear it in social media and all that kind of stuff. Yet when we look at it objectively, younger individuals are doing a lot better than middle-aged people. Right now, this has been trending since the 1980s and up to today. Middle age used to be the backbone of a given society because they're the ones having families. They're the ones with the jobs and being productive in the workplace. But we're seeing during this period of life the highest levels of needing to take antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. During this age group, we see the highest turnover rates with jobs. During this period, we see suicide and whatnot start to increase. We see divorce rates go up during this period of time. And this once backbone of our society has really started to be one of our more, we need to be paying attention to us in the middle age, I guess is what I would say. And so when we look at dysfunction, when we get to middle age, we'll need to talk about this transition period. We'll need to talk about what's going on currently with society and why is it that the middle-aged people are struggling so much. And we'll get into some of those debates as we move forward, okay? Just for those who I mentioned this last week, who should be taking human development classes: counselors, social works, parents, those who care for adult and children. And most nursing and medical programs require human development because we're learning that there's something in the early childhood literature, and it's been going on for decades now, called developmentally appropriate practices. And what they're trying to do in the early childhood education period is they're trying to take a child where they're at developmentally, and work and strengthen that development instead of, I always find it interesting when a parent asks a 2-year-old why they just did something. It's kind of an odd thing. Because, you think about cognition right then, and then all that happens is the parent gets frustrated and the child ends up being punished because child probably doesn't know how to answer an adult question, but I see it all the time. But anyways, this is where that kind of developmentally appropriate action comes in. And we're learning that even into adulthood, we need to know where people are developmentally. How many times I've heard a baby talk to an older person and those types of things. And So that's really kind of why this class is here too, is to help us understand where people are developmentally. So, all right. I mentioned that we're going to study in this class 3 main areas, okay? First is the biological. First is the biological area. And biology, mainly what we're going to be focusing on in this class is the nervous system and the development of the nervous system. But especially in early childhood, and then when we get into late adulthood, we also will need to talk about physical development. Because their association with where a person is behaviorally and cognitively are very much associated by where the body is in its developmental phases. Okay. We'll talk about cognitive processes and how cognition changes over time. We'll actually look at a theory known as a cognitive theory of development by Jean Piaget. And we'll see that, our cognition, our ability to think and problem solve changes as we develop, especially through childhood. And that can influence our biology and our socio-emotional outcomes, okay? Socio-emotional processes, I've been asked, why are we studying social and emotional together? And the reason is that emotions play an important role in our social world. And you can't separate the two from each other, because our emotions have 2 purposes. One, to signal to ourselves that everything is okay, or something's going wrong. But the other primary purpose of emotions is to let other people in our life know something's right or something's going wrong. And we'll look at this specifically when we get to what's called attachment theories, about how infants and children attach, and then how that can help or hinder development through the rest of the lifespan. So we'll spend some time talking about that. And again, just to play these together, all right, let's talk about socio-emotional development in the sense of trauma, okay, meaning neglect, child abuse, severe, just any type of trauma that a person goes through. If that trauma is not handled correctly by the world, we know that a brain can stop developing at that point, and cognition gets stuck in that developmental period. So again, this is the interplay between these things. And so when we talk about trauma later on in the course, or as we go through the course, it's just a good example of how our socio-emotional world, again, can influence our cognitive and our biological world. So it's an interplay between these 3 areas, okay? And when we're talking about biological processes, we'll need to look at, how much of development is due to nature, or what we call genetics, and how much of our development is due to nurture, meaning world experience. And what we'll see is it's probably a combination of the two. I don't think you would find a psychologist who is purely genetics or purely social and development in the world. It's probably a combination of the two, which we will see. We'll talk a little bit about genotypes and phenotypes. We'll get to that a little bit later. I just put that up there because our genotype is the actual genetics. Phenotypes is the expression of those genetics, but we'll get into that a little bit later when we start looking at development of womb development. And we also know biological processes of what's called optimal experience. What is true health? What is true well-being? What needs to be present for a human to grow and experience the world? And these are what we call life themes, which we will see in kind of an interplay between optimal developmental experiences versus non-optimal, and we'll see that we're all probably somewhere in between, the best to the worst, and that's just part of life. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that quick kind of introduction to what we're looking at before we start hitting theory? Okay. All right.
Are these notes available on Canvas?
They will be, yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay. So the first theory that we need to talk about is Sigmund Freud's theory, and there's one reason we start with this one in talking about development, because he's one of the very first who theorized about human development. He was the first to use his theory of personality and human existence to say that this is the developmental stages that a child goes through. And he introduced the notion of stage theory. And stage theory is when life supposedly, or development supposedly, occurs in different stages based upon our age and where we are, okay? So we're gonna start with his theory. The other reason why we should talk about Sigmund Freud is that there's a lot of his concepts that have permeated popular culture, as we will see, from notions of why people are overweight to why people are what's that adage, has a stick up their rear. He's kind of the person that started that whole idea, theoretically, not that they didn't exist before him. But one of the things that we should know about Sigmund Freud is when he went to school, he actually was studying neuroscience. He wanted to be a serious scientist. And he wanted to, I believe his dissertation was on the nervous system of a frog or something like that. But because he was Jewish, he wasn't allowed to be in the scientific field. They wouldn't let him into the scientific societies or anything, or universities, to be able to teach or be a scientist. So what he ended up doing, using his study of neurology, is he became a medical doctor specializing in brain disorder, mainly mental illnesses and the like. Okay, what this is going but he always wanted his theory to be based scientifically, and we'll see it. He might not have achieved that goal, but that was his idea. What he theorized, though, because he wanted to have his theory be taken scientifically and taken seriously, is he used a theory at the time which was growing in popularity, and it was evolutionary theory. Okay, he strongly took evolutionary theory, the idea that we start as something simple, and through time and history, an organism becomes more and more complex. Okay, and he's going to take the notion of evolution and try to figure out what is it that makes humans human. Okay, and he's going to come down to two very basic instincts. The first one is eros, which eros is what's called the life instinct, and Thantos, which is called the death instinct. He says human beings are driven by two forces: to reproduce, to put it in evolutionary terms, to reproduce and populate the earth and continue the species. Okay, but he said we also have this other basic tendency towards death, that we create life and then we die. Okay, and so he's going to reduce those, because if you think about life, death, those aren't necessarily drives. They're not something that can base behavior on that puts people to inaction. And so he's going to reduce our two basic needs to sex for reproduction and aggression towards death, and aggression towards each other, okay? And he's going to say that every human being is driven by these two basic instincts. He's going to argue, though, and I don't know if I have it in, he's going to argue, though, that these two basic instincts exist in the unconscious mind, meaning the things we're not aware of, okay? And he's going to put it in a very specific place called the id, okay? Id has a lot more meaning in German. Its direct kind of closest translation to English is it. So it's it's the place, okay? And this is where all of our psychological energies and everything comes from, but we don't have direct access to it, okay? Now, to put this in kind of basic form, so what Freud, we use this iceberg analogy, is that our unconscious world is much larger than our conscious world. Our conscious world is only those things that are safe for us to be aware of, okay? Because what Freud argued is if we really saw our unconscious mind, it would kind of drive us crazy in a sense, because that's the only two forces that drive us is sex and aggression. And those two things are counter to each other. So the id is a very chaotic, turmoiled world, okay? However, if all we had was an id, and we were only driven just to have sex and have aggression, you could imagine that the human species wouldn't last that long, okay? So what the id did is it developed what's known as the ego, okay? The ego has access to our external world, our conscious world, and has access to our unconscious world, okay? And the job of the ego is to try and find a balance between the desires of the id and the need of the external world, socialization, doing these kinds of things, okay? And so it's the ego that kind of is the executive branch of our mind, okay? It's kind of the decision maker about whether we should do an action or we shouldn't do an action, okay? Now, there is a concept later added by Freud of the superego, which does not have access to the external world, but it's called, in Freudian terms, the moral component of the unconscious mind. But please be careful with the word morality when it comes to Freudian psychology, because moral means perfect. Okay, it doesn't mean happiness. It doesn't making good decision. It doesn't mean those things. What the superego does is it tries to make it so a person behaves exactly how they should behave in a given social situation. It's that part of us that kind of says when we go into a classroom, if we're a student, we sit at a chair and we take notes. If we're an instructor, we talk way too much. Okay. So don't confuse the notions of morality with, happiness and those types of things. It is for Freud, morality was acting perfect, or as perfect as one should. So, all right. So this is his notion of the human mind, and he says everything is driven by these forces that we don't necessarily have access to. Okay. Now, I do want just to keep in mind that one of the criticisms of Freud, if we go back here, is his theory was based on his clinical population. Okay. So his theory was based on the people that he worked with who had psychosis. He worked with a lot of sexual assault victims and criminal-minded individuals. And one of the big criticisms about his theory is he's taking this subpopulation, this clinical population, and is assuming that it is applicable to everyone. Okay, so it's important to state because when he does introduce his developmental theory, we're going to see some of these issues kind of come out. Okay. So later in Freud's life, after he had developed his theory of the unconscious, our two primary drives, he felt it was important to do a developmental theory, okay? Mainly because in his practice, what he learned working with individuals is a person's trauma, the reason for their mental illness, according to psychoanalysis, can be found in the past, specifically the early childhood experience a child has with the mother, okay? And he's going to trace a lot of stuff back to that early developmental phases. This is where you get the stereotype about counseling, and they want to go into your past and they want to dig up stuff from your early childhood and all that kind of stuff. This is kind of the start of that stereotype we have of counselors and the like. I will tell you that in modern counseling terms, digging stuff up out of someone's past really isn't beneficial. It really doesn't have any clinical purpose. It does help develop understandings between the counselor and the client, but as far as having a therapeutic value, there's really little evidence for that. So, but we do know that this time period is very important. But because of his theory being sexual, he was forced to make his developmental theory sexual. Okay, he actually really didn't want to originally, but he noticed that if he had any deviations from his theory to his developmental theory, then he would have a lot of explaining to do. Okay, so the first kind of developmental theory we have is what's called psychosexual stages of development. Okay, and what Freud believed is that different periods of life, a child is getting some type of gratification or satisfaction from that developmental area. Okay, and if we think about ages 0 to 2, in order to get nutrition, an infant has to have a sucking reflex and be able to orally ingest. Okay, and so what Freud believed is that the first psychosexual stage, the first area of gratification was oral gratification. Okay, now what he believed is if we didn't get past the need to ingest, to the need to orally gratify, we would become what he called orally fixed. Okay, he himself felt like he had an oral fixation because from like the age of 12 on, he couldn't go a day without having a cigar in his mouth. In fact, he died of jaw cancer from his cigar smoking. Okay, and he says he just couldn't live without having that sensation in the mouth. Okay, and that really is the highlight of what being orally fixated is. And he also argued that this also explains things like obesity, that people are obese because they ingest, they can't get enough oral gratification through their mouth, which goes into our popular culture, the myth of people who are overweight, being that they eat too much. We've all heard this. If you believe that, you're a Freudian, because there's really little evidence that people who are obese actually do overeat. Yes, you have the stories of some people and whatnot, but obesity has more to do with our genetics and our metabolism than it does with people overeating. But this really permeated the popular culture to where even today there's nutritionists who believe that obesity, you got to stop eating so many calories, blah, blah, blah. If Some people would just have to stop eating if that was the case. But anyways, I'm going on too much on this. If you did get through the oral phase and you didn't have an oral fixation, it promoted your health and well-being. It had a positive effect because you have you're learning the thing about self-control. Okay, so this is 0 to 2. And then he went into what's known as the anal phase, which happens between about 2 to 4. This is when a lot of children are potty training. If there was ever, we always celebrate periods of life. We give diplomas for high school and all those kinds of things. I really think our first achievement in life really should be given to this moment of potty training. Okay, because I want you to think about it. I want you to think about it from its non-simplistic terms about what potty training requires a person to do. It requires us to do two things: give in to the demands of the world, give in to the demands of an authority figure. This is the first time a child's really going to need to obey the social world. Because if they don't, they end up socially humiliated. Okay, my spouse is a director of a childcare, and she's mentioned stories of young children who get severely bullied for having accidents and stuff like that. Okay, but anyways, I'm digressing a little bit. So the second thing that it requires us to do is take control of our biological processes. It requires us to say, I am not going to defecate or urinate right now. I'm going to wait, and I'm going to do it in an appropriate place during an appropriate time. So we're taking over somewhat our biology. We're saying it doesn't control us, we control it. So there's two significant things that are happening during this period of potty training. Okay. Now, what Freud believed is if a child wasn't able to gain that internal control of themselves, they became anally fixated. Okay. If you've ever known anybody that is called anal, this is where that terminology came from. A person who is anal, who has a stick up their rear, the belief Freud had is because they couldn't take control of their internal world, they take over control of their external world. So they're the perfectionists. They have to have everything just right. Their shoes and their shirts are hung just perfect. It doesn't look like, if they're in a class and they're the ones that always have to be in control. Okay. And what Freud believed is it's because they didn't have any internal control, they take excessive control over the world. And so when you call someone anal, or if you've been, I won't say if you've been called anal, I hope not, that's where that terminology comes from. Okay. All right. The second phase that Freud believed in was what's called the phallic phase. Okay, and this is where we need to stop for a minute and understand this period of time. The phallic phase is simply when a child realizes that when they rub certain parts of their body that have dense sensory cells in it, it feels good. Okay. And it's not uncommon to find a child rubbing themselves, their private parts or whatever other erogenous zones during this period. The thing that I want to make clear, though, there's a couple things. One is we actually know that children will engage in this behavior much younger. In fact, there's even evidence that children do it within the womb. We also need to separate, if we're going to use the term masturbation, we need to separate the term child masturbation versus adult masturbation. Child masturbation occurs when a child just really recognizes that feels really good. Okay. Adult masturbation implements the notion of fantasy, of the idea of doing that with someone else, even though someone else isn't present. And that's really the difference that we need to talk about. This is good information for parents, because when you walk in on your child and they're doing that, it's a good time to explore. Are they doing it because it's natural? But if they start saying, oh, I'm thinking about this, or someone else, or this, that's when you should be concerned as a parent. That's when you should be really starting to investigate who's around your child and what behaviors have been being taught to them. So this is kind of good information for parents. You don't have to freak out when you walk in on your child anymore, but it gives you the opportunity to open up that conversation. And are they doing it just because it feels good, or are they doing it because they've learned that that's a fantasy thing and there might be the chance for abuse during this period? Anyways, but the phallic phase also deals with something that Freud added to his theory to really bring out the complexity of the parent-child relationship. And he called this the Oedipus complex. If anyone knows the Greek story of Oedipus, he was born with a fate that he was going to end up killing his dad and having some type of sexual relationship with his mother. Okay. Now, because of that, he left his parents because he didn't want that to come true. So he left, he got away, and no, wait, I digress. Okay. Based on that, Oedipus was taken to another town, to another parents, kind of like adopted parents. Okay. And then in his later childhood, he learned about the story about how he might end up killing his dad and having relationships with his mom. So he left his adoptive parents and he ended up in the town where he didn't know them, his biological parents is, and lo and behold, he did fall in love with his mother. He did end up killing his dad, his real dad, to have relationships with his mother. We should say this story is a little bit more complex because he didn't know that's what he was doing, because he didn't know they were his parents. Okay. Anyways, that's the Greek story. But in Freudian terms, it's this notion that a young boy looks at his mother and wants her. His first love object, his first desire would be to be with her. But he recognizes that there's something in the way called the father. Okay. And so what does the little boy do? He starts imitating the father in order to gain relationships with the mother. Okay. Later on, Carl Jung's going to add a similar complex for girls called the Electra complex. And this is where it's a little bit different than what boys go through. Really, it is she wants to gain access to the father because she noticed dad has something she doesn't, and that's a penis. And so the girl goes through penis envy. How do you take care of that? Who has access to dad's stuff? Well, mom does. So the young girl starts to imitate the mother in order to try and gain access to the father. Okay, this is about the point when most people start reading Freudian theory and they go, okay, he was just a pervert. And they stop there and they say, I'm not doing this anymore. But I want to state that I think Freud was trying to inform us about something that does happen during this developmental period. It has nothing to do with sex and sexuality or wanting to, kill dad so he can be with mom. It doesn't really have anything to do with that. But children during this age group, and it actually starts a little bit younger, do a certain type of play. They do role playing. Okay, so this is when you role play being a firefighter, a doctor, teacher, you role play playing house with mom, dad. Role playing is a huge part of a child's life during this period, because what they're trying to do is learn how to be an adult, how to be who they are. And the two people that they role play a lot is the relationship between mom and dad. Okay, and a boy recognizes I'm most like dad, and so I role play probably dad. And you know, if I'm a girl, most likely I'll imitate mom. Okay, and what we have learned in the past, I would say, I always have to update this. I've been teaching too long. Last 40 years, I got to add 10 years, 40 years since the divorce rates and everything have become more and more, and we're getting our first and second and third generation of children who were raised in a single parent household. We are finding that if a young boy was raised by a single mother, okay, and the mom did not provide any access to healthy male role models, whether it be a boyfriend, grandpa, uncle, whoever it may be. And in the same vein, a father who is single and raises a girl, and he doesn't provide access to healthy female role models, you know, a girlfriend or, you know, grandma or whoever. We do find that these children do have difficulties in adulthood, in adult relationships, okay? And they tend to have a hard time adjusting and understanding this thing we call intimacy, okay? So I think what Freud was trying to get to during this period is that parents, or even if you're a single parent, we have to role model those healthy interactions with the opposite sex. Okay, and we're even finding that within same-sex relationships, this is also important. If you're in a same-sex relationship, we still have to have children exposed to different sexes, and a lot of same-sex parents actually do quite a good job of this, I should say. So I think that's what Freud was trying to get to, even though he ended up with kind of the weirdness of the sexuality component, okay? One of the unfortunate parts about Freud's theory was when he went into middle to late childhood. He called this the latent period. Uh-oh, I think we lost the... I think we lost our screen. Hold on, everyone. I might have to... All right. Well, is this still on?
I think the Zoom ended. That's what I did in our social class.
Oh, really?
And she noticed that it's only giving her so many time for one session. And so she told us it's gonna shut off. She told us to log back on.
Well, I think we're still on because we can hear ourselves. Oh, there we are. Interesting. Well, we have it a little bit, so. Can everyone in Zoom world still see us and hear us?
Yes, I can still see the screen and hear you.
Okay, cool. Maybe it's just interesting. I see it. We'll go from here. The latent phase of development. Sorry, our screen here at the classroom shut off on us. So, and now it's only given us a very small picture. So, anyways, let's talk about the latent period. I feel this was one of the more unfortunate parts about Freud's theory, because basically what he's going to say is nothing major developmentally occurs between 6 and puberty. The unfortunate part of that is that he said, you know, we do some skill development, learn how to write, those types of things, but nothing that's really going to impact our life. And I've always felt that this was an unfortunate thing, because that when we start looking into other theories, when we look at research, this is one of the more neglected age groups that have been studied. A lot of studies we have come out of you know, the elementary schools and school experiences, but as we will see when we get through this period of time, unfortunately, this age group has been neglected. And so if you want to go into developmental psychology, there's still a lot of room to learn about this elementary years of a child's life. So, but eventually what we do is we hit puberty, which is physical maturation, as you would say. We're gaining our adult body and adult functioning. And what Freud believed is, you know, if we were successful, oh, I should go back to the phallic stage. What happens when we become fixated in the phallic stage? Let me explain that really quick, and I apologize. People who cannot get control over needing to satisfy their body because of the nerves and the bundles that exist, they become risk takers. They become impulsive. And so what Freud believed is that someone that gets stuck in the phallic phase, they're the ones who are risk takers. They're the ones who are impulsive decision makers. These are the ones who most likely will end up in some type of jail or some type of reformatory, which when we look at the morals of the time, a lot of people believe that the criminally minded were, you know, sexual deviants and those types of things. So that kind of makes sense why he would put this during this period. Okay. All right. Back to here. The genital phase, according to Freud, which lasts until about 18, is when we learn appropriate sexual relationships with others. Okay. So if we were successful in these 3 phases, this phase is pretty, you know, pretty successful. It's pretty easy to get through. And that's kind of the idea behind these stage theories, is if we successfully get through the earlier phases, then when we get to this mature sexuality is when we're able to, you know, appropriately talk to someone, appropriately have relationships with someone. Okay. But it's this 0 to 18 where everything that we've learned through our developmental phases kind of accumulate and determine whether or not we'll be able to have healthy relationships as we move on. Okay. So that's Freud's theory. Does anybody have any questions on his stuff? Okay. I should wrap up with just talking a little bit about this. Is there scientific evidence behind his pure theory? Not really, mainly because if you look at Freudian theory isn't testable. It's a circular theory, okay? Why did I do something? Because of your unconscious mind. Well, what does my unconscious mind? It produces your behavior. So it's not really a testable theory in and of itself. As I mentioned, kind of the stranger parts of his theories, socially, are relationships between parents important? Yes, we know that, but it probably has little to nothing to do with human sexuality. And we do know that during this latent period, there are important things that are happening. But his theory is important because it sets up the stages of development. We're going to put things in developmental phases now, stages. And there were, as I mentioned, there's some cultural things that came out of Freud's theory. So that's why we start with this one. Okay. The one that I think we should put off until Wednesday is Piaget's. I'm just going to kind of introduce him at this moment, and then we'll go through his stage theory. Jean Piaget was actually, when he got into studying development, he was interested in the imprinting of ducklings. Okay, imprinting is that the first kind of a figure that a duckling sees after they come out of their egg is what that duckling will attach to. Okay, so he actually, there's pictures of geese following him everywhere, because in some of his experiments, he was the first thing that a hatchling saw. So they would constantly follow Piaget around. And Piaget wanted to know, does imprinting occur in human beings? When we come out of mom's womb, is it important that, those are the first people that we imprint on? The story goes, in a sense, that he realized that the mental life of human beings is much more complex, that humans have thought, we have thought processes. And so instead of looking at imprinting, he looked at how we develop cognitively. Cognitive meaning decision-making, higher processes of the mind, those kinds of things, how we categorize things. And he's going to come up with a developmental theory of thought, basically cognition, okay? And he's going to stress kind of three things through his developmental phases. Is that for Piaget, stress for a child was important, okay? Now, not stress as far as abusing a child, but having a child get into situations which creates a conflict within the child. And he believed that the job of a parent is to make sure that a child experiences stress in a safe place, okay? Because it's only through these type of interactions that we can develop thought, we can develop complexity, okay? And he believed that we do this through two processes. One is assimilation and one is accommodation, which we will go over Wednesday. But basically, assimilation is when we take new knowledge in, or we assimilate things. So we see a dog and we see other kinds of dog and we create a model of the dog. So everything that's close to looking like that, we categorize as a dog, okay? Accommodation is the process of setting up new knowledge, okay? Giving something newness. Accommodation is all of a sudden the child runs into a cat. Well, a cat has 4 legs, a tail, furry, most of them, ears, all those kinds of things, but it meows and it has real weird whiskers. And you compare that to your model of a dog and you realize, well, even though they look a lot alike, they're two separate things. So I have to accommodate for that knowledge. So now I have 2 categories, dogs and cats, okay? That's a simple way of explaining that, but let's hold off until Wednesday to really get into Piaget's theory. Again, if you want to read in your textbook about this theory, it would be a good idea in preparation for Wednesday. I believe it's chapter 1 or chapter 2 that goes through this specific theory as well. But let's go ahead, because it will take some time to get through his stages. Let's go ahead and end class for today. And then we'll pick this topic up on Wednesday. So I'm gonna, does any